April 12, 1941. RAF Cranwell, Lincolnshire, England. The morning mist rolled low over the airfield, curling like smoke across the runway. Mechanics in heavy coats stood silently, their breath visible in the cold air, eyes fixed on the strange, stubby aircraft sitting at the far end of the tarmac. It didn't look like anything they'd ever seen. No spinning propeller. No piston engine. Just a sleek, silver body with a single circular intake that seemed to swallow the world in front of it. Inside the cockpit sat squadron leader Jerry Sayer, his gloved hands gripping the stick, waiting for the signal. The aircraft, Gloster E.28/39, was the product of one man's obsession. And today, that obsession was about to defy gravity. Down on the ground, Frank Whittle, now a Royal Air Force officer and engineer, stood apart from the small group of officers and technicians. His face was tense, eyes locked on his creation. For years, they had called him reckless. Unrealistic. Mad. But today, he was about to prove them wrong, or die trying. The starter whined. Then came a rising whir, an alien sound to the ears of men raised on the familiar thrum of propellers. It grew sharper, louder, until it was a scream of pure mechanical fury. Whittle's heart pounded. That sound was the future. Sayer released the brakes. The jet rolled forward, slowly at first, then faster, slicing through the morning fog. The roar deepened, a strange, continuous thrust instead of the rhythmic hammer of pistons. As the aircraft lifted from the runway, every man watching held his breath. For a few seconds, silence reigned, no clattering engine noise, no vibration, just a smooth, ghostly hum. The aircraft climbed steadily, slicing through the haze. Whittle exhaled, a smile breaking across his face for the first time in months. His mad idea had flown. But this moment had not come easily. Behind that single flight lay years of ridicule, bureaucratic roadblocks, and near collapse. The world didn't yet know that air combat, and the fate of nations, would be changed forever by this quiet, determined engineer. To understand how Whittle reached this moment, we must go back, to a time when his vision was dismissed as fantasy. Cambridge, England, 1928. A young cadet named Frank Whittle sat alone in his small room at the RAF College Cranwell, a notebook open before him. Outside, the sound of piston engines echoed over the airfield as biplanes lifted into the cool morning sky. Whittle, barely 20 years old, watched them climb, slowly, laboriously, their propellers slicing through the air. They were magnificent, yes, but limited. And in those limits, he saw a challenge. He turned back to his notes, scribbling equations furiously. His idea was simple in theory, yet radical beyond belief. Instead of using propellers to push air backward, why not compress air, mix it with fuel, ignite it, and expel it at high speed to produce continuous thrust? A self-contained engine with no moving propeller blades, a jet. The concept had been discussed in passing before, but no one had ever made it practical. The materials didn't yet exist to withstand the heat. The physics were brutal. And the skepticism, absolute. Still, Whittle persisted. By 1929, he submitted his design to the Air Ministry, hoping the RAF might see the potential. Instead, they rejected it outright. Too complicated. Too risky. Too expensive. They told him it wouldn't work. For most men, that would have been the end of it. But Whittle was different. His mind refused to let go. Even as he flew aircraft for the RAF, his thoughts were consumed by turbines, compressors, and the whispering promise of thrust unbound by propellers. In 1930, he patented the world's first turbojet engine. But without funding, the patent was useless. The Air Ministry dismissed his vision again, declaring it a fantasy of youth. The paperwork gathered dust. Years passed. Whittle continued to fly, promoted to flight lieutenant, admired for his skill, but quietly regarded as eccentric. Few knew he was mortgaging his own future, pouring every shilling of his meager pay into research. He borrowed, begged, and worked nights, designing parts with a few trusted colleagues. By 1936, he'd formed a small company called Power Jets Ltd., working out of an old foundry in Rugby. The workshop smelled of oil, sweat, and burning metal. The equipment was crude, scavenged, improvised. But the dream was alive. Each day was a battle, not against physics, but against disbelief. Engineers from established firms laughed at the design. "You'll melt the turbine," they said. "It can't produce enough thrust." Even his superiors in the RAF seemed embarrassed by his obsession. And yet, when the first small jet engine finally sputtered to life on April 12, 1937, it screamed with a sound unlike anything on Earth. Whittle stood transfixed, the roar washing over him like music. Flames licked from the tailpipe, the compressor whirring in perfect harmony. For a few seconds, it worked, then the bearings failed, and the engine seized. Whittle exhaled, covered in oil and sweat, but smiling through exhaustion. It wasn't a failure. It was proof. Word spread quietly through the engineering world. The madman from Rugby had done something extraordinary. But still, the Air Ministry offered only token support. It wasn't until war loomed on the horizon that Britain began to take notice. As Europe darkened in the late 1930s, and the Luftwaffe's modern bombers cast their shadow across the continent, the RAF finally realized, speed would soon decide the skies. And the man they'd once dismissed might hold the key to survival. Coventry, England, September 1939. The air raid sirens wailed through the factory yards as workers scrambled for cover. Britain was once again at war, and while most minds turned to defense and survival, one man's thoughts burned on a different battlefield, the future of flight. Inside a dimly lit workshop on the outskirts of the city, Frank Whittle, now gaunt and hollow-eyed from years of overwork, stood beside the latest version of his jet engine. His team at Power Jets Ltd., a handful of young engineers and mechanics, worked frantically under blackout curtains, their tools clattering against steel as they tuned the machine that might change everything. The RAF, desperate for any advantage, had finally given him limited funding and access to materials. But their support came with skepticism. They didn't expect results, they merely wanted to quiet the Whittle problem. "Sir," one mechanic called out, tightening a bolt, "she's ready." Whittle nodded, his jaw tight. The new engine, the W.1, was the culmination of nearly a decade of sacrifice. Every piece had been designed, tested, and rebuilt countless times. It was crude by modern standards, but it held promise: a sleek, cylindrical body, air compressor at one end, exhaust at the other. No propeller. Just pure thrust. When Whittle opened the fuel line, there was a moment of silence. Then, ignition. A deafening roar filled the small hangar. Flames burst from the exhaust, heat shimmering across the walls. The men cheered as the turbine stabilized at full power. The noise was continuous, raw, elemental, like the scream of a new world being born. Whittle's hands shook as he watched the gauges rise. The readings were steady. Temperature within limits. Thrust exceeding predictions. It was working, perfectly. He leaned in close to the engine, his voice barely audible over the roar. They said it couldn't be done. Outside, in a nearby office, representatives from the Air Ministry watched through a narrow window. For the first time, their expressions changed from doubt to awe. One of them muttered, "Good God, it actually flies." The next step was inevitable: they needed to build an aircraft around it. The Gloster Aircraft Company was chosen for the task, led by designer George Carter. Whittle worked side by side with Carter, translating his engine into a machine that could take to the sky. The result was the Gloster E.28/39, a small, bullet-shaped aircraft built around the W.1 engine. It looked alien compared to the Hurricanes and Spitfires of the day. No propeller, no spinner, no nose intake clutter, just smooth, purposeful lines. By 1941, with the world engulfed in flames and the Luftwaffe terrorizing British skies, the jet project moved from experiment to potential weapon. But still, secrecy cloaked everything. The E.2839 was known only to a handful of officers and engineers. As test day approached, Whittle barely slept. He walked the hangars late at night, checking connections, inspecting panels, tightening bolts no one else would notice. To him, this wasn't just an invention, it was vindication. When the day finally came, April 12, 1941, Whittle stood beside the runway at Cranwell, watching his creation roar into life, seeing it rise into the clouds, smooth and silent. The impossible had flown. But what he didn't yet know, across the channel, another engineer was racing toward the same dream. Germany had its own mad genius. And his name was Hans von Ohain. Rostock, Germany, August 1939. While Whittle's team in England labored in secrecy and scarcity, another mind on the continent was following the same dangerous dream, and he was about to beat the clock. Inside the Heinkel aircraft factory, a young physicist named Dr. Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain stood beside his creation, the Heinkel E.28. It was small, compact, and unlike anything in the German Luftwaffe's arsenal. And like Whittle's prototype, it bore a startling difference: there was no propeller. Von Ohain, working with aircraft designer Ernst Heinkel, had developed a jet engine based on the same principle: compressed air, fuel ignition, and thrust. But unlike Whittle, von Ohain had something Whittle never did: state support, resources, and political protection. At dawn on August 27, 1939, test pilot Erich Warsitz climbed into the cockpit. The airfield was quiet. A few engineers stood nearby, shielding their eyes from the sun as the strange aircraft began to hum. The engine ignited, and for the first time in history, a jet-powered aircraft flew. It stayed airborne only for a few minutes, barely surpassing 600 km per hour, but it was enough. Germany had entered the jet age, just 1 week before invading Poland. Von Ohain's success remained a closely guarded secret, hidden under layers of wartime classification. To the outside world, propellers still ruled the skies. But in the laboratories and hangars of both nations, a silent race had begun, one that would redefine air combat before the war's end. Back in Britain, Whittle heard whispers of German progress. He was furious, not with von Ohain, but with the bureaucrats who had delayed his work for nearly a decade. If they'd listened, he told a friend bitterly, we'd have been flying jets before them. But there was no time for bitterness. With Britain under siege, the RAF needed innovation more than ever. The Air Ministry authorized full development of Whittle's engines for combat use. The Gloster Meteor, Britain's first operational jet fighter, began its design phase. By 1943, the Meteor was ready for trials. Its twin engines, derived from Whittle's original W.WWII design, roared with a haunting smoothness. Test pilots described the acceleration as otherworldly. No torque, no vibration, just relentless, effortless speed. Meanwhile, across Europe, German engineers pushed forward with their own weapon, the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe. Powered by twin Junkers Jumo 004 jet engines, it was faster, deadlier, and more advanced than anything the Allies possessed. By mid-1944, the first Me 262s screamed through the clouds over Germany. They were like ghosts, faster than any Spitfire, able to dive, climb, and strike before their enemies even saw them. Allied pilots radioed in panic. They're too fast. Can't get a shot. The jet age had arrived, and it belonged to those who had once been called madmen. But the story was not one of triumph alone. Both Whittle and von Ohain paid a personal price for their genius. Whittle's body began to fail under years of exhaustion and stress. The pressure of bureaucracy, secrecy, and constant technical setbacks pushed him to the edge of breakdown. He was hospitalized, suffering from severe nervous strain. Von Ohain, too, watched as his innovation was consumed by a war machine. His peaceful dream of scientific progress had been transformed into a weapon of destruction. The jets they created would change the course of history, but at a cost neither had truly foreseen. And as the war reached its final, desperate months, their machines would meet in the skies for the first time. July 25, 1944, over the skies of Munich, Germany. The sun was a blazing disk above the clouds, the air thin and trembling with heat. Below, black columns of smoke rose from the bombed-out factories of Bavaria. High above them, two new Predators prowled the sky, the first jet fighters to ever meet in combat. On one side, Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber, flying the Messerschmitt Me 262, a sleek, shark-nosed machine that looked more like the future than anything the world had seen. Twin Junkers Jumo engines howled behind him as he dove on a formation of American B-24 bombers. The heavy bombers filled the sky with black bursts of flak, their waist gunners firing wildly at the streak of silver that closed the distance at more than 500 miles per hour. Schreiber's guns barked, 30mm shells tearing into a bomber's wing. The aircraft burst into flames, spiraling down. The Me-262 screamed past before any escort could react. For a moment, Schreiber felt invincible. Nothing could touch him. No piston-driven fighter could match his speed. He was flying the cutting edge of the Reich's technology, a weapon meant to turn back the tide of Allied air power. But the Me-262 was still fragile. Its engines were temperamental, prone to flameouts and failures. And the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel, parts, and time to perfect it. For every jet that made it to combat, two more sat grounded. Across the channel, the British were preparing their answer. At RAF Manby, the first operational Gloster Meteor F.1 fighters were being assembled. Painted in dull camouflage, they didn't look futuristic, but inside, they housed Whittle's revolutionary engines. The same concept that had once been laughed out of meeting rooms now hummed beneath their wings. The Meteor's first missions weren't glamorous. Their task was to hunt down German V-1 flying bombs, pilotless jet-powered missiles raining destruction on London. The Meteors intercepted them with blistering speed, tipping them out of the sky with their wings when their guns jammed. But soon, the Meteor would face a far greater test. By late 1944, Allied intelligence reported Me-262 units attacking bomber formations deep in Germany. Orders went out: if a Meteor ever crossed paths with a German jet, it was to engage immediately. For a few tense weeks, it seemed inevitable. Both sides had jets in the air. Both knew the other existed. The first true jet-on-jet duel was coming. It nearly happened over the Rhine in early 1945. RAF pilot flying officer William Wilson spotted a fast-moving aircraft on his radar, too fast for a piston engine. He dove, catching a glimpse of something silver flashing through the clouds. It moved like lightning, he later recalled. By the time I turned, it was gone. No confirmed kills were recorded that day, but history had already shifted. For the first time, human beings were fighting wars not with the steady thrum of propellers, but with the scream of turbines. The skies had changed forever. As 1945 dawned, both Whittle and von Ohain watched the machines they had birthed tear through the clouds, symbols of progress and destruction alike. Neither man had set out to build weapons. They had dreamed of speed, of pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But in war, every dream was twisted to serve strategy. When Germany fell in May 1945, the world stood on the threshold of a new era. Allied engineers swarmed over captured airfields, studying Me-262 wrecks, dismantling their engines, sketching diagrams, taking notes. Across the ocean, the Americans and Soviets began their own programs, racing to claim the future. The age of the jet had begun, and there would be no going back. Yet amid the triumph, Whittle's own life was unraveling. Years of strain, lack of recognition, and financial ruin had taken their toll. His company, power jets, was absorbed by the government. His invention, once his life's purpose, was taken from his hands. But history would not forget him. Decades later, pilots flying at twice the speed of sound would look back and know it all began with one man, and one mad idea that refused to die. London, 1946. The war was over. The bombs had stopped falling, the skies were quiet again, but for Frank Whittle, silence brought little peace. He sat alone in a modest office at the Ministry of Supply, the morning light filtering through dust-covered blinds. On his desk lay a single document stamped in bold red letters, Nationalization Order, Power Jets Ltd. After years of struggle, after creating the very engine that had redefined flight, his company had been taken from him. The British government now controlled everything, the patents, the designs, the future of jet propulsion. Whittle's hands, once blackened by grease and fire, now trembled as he signed the paper that ended his control. For a long moment, he simply stared at his reflection in the window. The man who had dreamed of touching the stars now looked hollow, defeated. He whispered softly to himself, "They called me mad, and now they call me obsolete." But the world outside was changing faster than even Whittle had imagined. Across the Atlantic, captured German scientists were working with the U.S. Army Air Forces, their knowledge of the Me-262's engines fueling America's next generation of aircraft. In the Soviet Union, engineers dissected captured jets in hidden research centers, copying, modifying, improving. Every major nation was suddenly obsessed with one thing: speed. The names began to change: Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, MiG-9, de Havilland Vampire, Gloster Meteor Mk3. Each a direct descendant of Whittle's spark, each a new chapter in the race he had started alone in a cramped workshop in Rugby a decade before. For all the power of these new machines, few understood how much they owed to a quiet Englishman who had once been told to stop dreaming. Meanwhile, in Germany, von Ohain's story was no happier. Captured by Allied forces in 1945, he was questioned extensively, his research seized. Unlike many of his peers, von Ohain wasn't a party loyalist, he had been a scientist, not a soldier. The Americans recognized his brilliance and quietly brought him to work in the United States, where he joined the U.S. Air Force Research Laboratory. There, two former enemies, Whittle and von Ohain, would eventually meet. It happened in 1960, during an aviation conference in the United States. The two men, now older, both weary from their battles with governments and institutions, shook hands for the first time. There was no rivalry, no bitterness, only mutual respect. Whittle smiled faintly and said, "You know, Hans, they thought we were both insane." Von Ohain chuckled, replying, "Perhaps they were right. But look what madness has made." By then, the world had already flown beyond the clouds. The jet age had become the space age. Supersonic aircraft like the F-104 Starfighter and English Electric Lightning pierced the stratosphere. Passenger jets carried civilians across oceans in hours, not days. Every single one of them traced its lineage back to a small, unassuming workshop in 1930s Britain, to a man who dared to imagine flight without propellers. In his later years, Whittle finally received recognition long overdue. He was knighted, awarded honorary degrees, and named one of the most influential engineers in history. Yet he lived simply, always haunted by the toll his dream had taken. In one of his final interviews, he was asked if he regretted it, the sleepless nights, the stress, the breakdowns, the decades of struggle. Whittle smiled gently and said, "Regret? No. Every engineer dreams of changing the world. I was just lucky enough to live long enough to see it happen." Epilogue: The Legacy of a Mad Idea. From the Gloster E.28 to the F-35 Lightning II, every turbine that ever screamed across the sky carries a trace of Whittle's defiance, the belief that the impossible was merely an engineering problem waiting to be solved. He was called reckless. He was called foolish. He was called mad. But when Frank Whittle's idea took flight, the world followed. And air combat, indeed, human flight itself, would never be the same again.